This video is going to continue our consideration of the topic of capital punishment and is now going to look at the work of Hugo Bedau, as he is an abolitionist and comes against the idea of capital punishment. We continue with the archery motif, the idea of trying to do that which is ethical or moral as being like aiming at a target and trying to hit the bullseye. So the late Hugo Bedau was Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. He died in 2012, I believe. And this is from his paper, How to Argue About the Death Penalty. He's written a lot about this topic, and the ACLU's pamphlets that they use to oppose the death penalty are primarily written by Hugo Bedau. I want to say before we even get started that what's refreshing in considering Bedau is that he does not use any fallacies such as ad hominem argumentation or straw man argumentation when he addresses those that are for the death penalty. He actually portrays it very generously. He gives his opponents the best consideration that he could, and if you were a proponent of the death penalty, I think you would like the way he would describe your position. So he holds that the argument over the death penalty in the United States has been focused in the wrong direction in the recent past. It has, he says, been especially fixated on disputed questions of fact. So when he says that, these are the things that are the primary arguments that we always hear about the death penalty from either side. And so these primary questions of fact have been, is the death penalty a greater deterrent to murder than life imprisonment without parole? And each side says it is or it isn't based on what their own conviction is. Is the death penalty being applied in a discriminatory way? There seems to be certainly some empirical evidence that it is. What is the risk that an innocent person will be executed? And what is the risk that a convicted murderer who is not executed will kill again in or out of jail if not given life without parole? So he thinks that anybody who studies the evidence must conclude these things about those four questions. There's little or no evidence that the death penalty is a better deterrent to murder than is life in prison. In fact, life in prison and execution are about equally effective, or if you like, ineffective. There's evidence that the death penalty has been and continues to be administered in a manner that produces arbitrary and racially discriminatory results in sentencing. Those of you who looked at the video with Jeremy Irons remember him saying that in the United States the saying is that capital punishment means that those who don't have the capital get the punishment. They can't buy justice, as it were. It is impossible to calculate the risk that an innocent person will be executed, but, he says rightly, the risk is not zero. And some convicted murderers have killed again, no question, that's a pro-death penalty argument, either in prison or after release, so there is a risk that others will do so as well. The facts as they currently stand, and seen from the abolitionist perspective, those who want to do away with the death penalty, do not point strongly and overwhelmingly to the futility of the death penalty or to the harm it does. Nor do the facts show that the alternative of life imprisonment is, on balance, a noticeably superior punishment. He's saying on the basis of the facts, neither side can prove its case. I'm an abolitionist, and we can't prove our case just by the facts. But the marginal impact of the empirical evidence is not the major factor in explaining why settling disputes over matters of fact does not and cannot settle the larger controversy over the death penalty itself. As a matter of sheer logic, it is not possible to deduce a policy conclusion, something at a governmental level, from any set of factual premises, however general and well supported. We are arguing in the wrong arena, is what he's saying. We should be arguing from principles, not just from facts. Any argument intended to recommend continuing or reforming current policy on the death penalty must include amongst its premises one or more normative propositions. In other words, rules with regard to what is normative ethically. Unless disputants over the death penalty can agree about these normative propositions, their argument on the empirical facts will never suffice to resolve their dispute. We've got to shift the argument to a different playing field. Here's his point. The real issue is the morality of the death penalty. Whether the death penalty should be legal or not is actually a moral question which cannot be argued merely from facts. We must identify and agree upon ethical and societal moral norms before this discussion or debate can ever really go anywhere. Bedau goes on to say that norms concerning the death penalty can be divided into two groups: those that express relevant and desirable social goals or purposes that we want to accomplish in society, and those which express relevant and respectable moral principles. The first one's governmental, the second one is ethical. Bedau thinks that the way to argue about the death penalty is to look at the social goals relevant to punishment in general, and then to look at the moral principles which dictate how to achieve those social goals. Once we've looked at the social goals, which are relevant to punishment in general, and have identified and evaluated the moral principles relevant to punishment, then and only then can we consider whatever facts are relevant to the issue. We want to have a principled discussion. Thus, Bedau says that the issue of the death penalty can be resolved, in theory, by first looking at what our social goals are, what governmentally we want to accomplish, and how they should be constrained by our moral principles, and then by looking at whatever facts are relevant to the use of the death penalty as a kind of punishment. First, identify our social goals. Why do we punish crime? What are we after, he says? Well, then process those goals, once we've looked at them, through the lens of the moral principles that we believe apply to punishments. And then we're now ready to discuss the facts. We've set the stage to have a profitable discussion of the facts by going through the first two steps above. We've got to create a new playing field, a playing field based upon social goals and moral principles that apply to all of this. So here's the social goals. He says there's really two especially relevant social goals. Punishments ought to contribute to the reduction of crime, and they ought to be economical. It ought to be that it's feasible for us economically to do this. The instrumental character of these purposes and goals is evident, he says. They reflect the fact that society does not institute and maintain the practice of punishment for its own sake, as though it were a good in itself, as though punishment were a good in itself. Rather, punishment is, and is seen to be, a means to an end or ends. We're after something when we pursue punishment. The justification of a society's punitive policies and practices, therefore, must involve two steps. First, it must be assumed or argued that these ends are desirable, that these are things that we should pursue. Second, it must be shown that the practice of punishment is a necessary means to these ends. This is the only way to get there. What is true of the justification of punishment generally is true a fortiori of justifying the death penalty. In other words, arguments that we would use for justification of punishment, those have to be taken into consideration when justifying the death penalty. If you have to justify punishment, then you especially have to justify the ultimate punishment. That's what he's saying. He doesn't shrink from going on to say that endorsements of these policy goals tends to encourage not opposition to, but support for the death penalty. Interesting. Why not? Well, whether punishment is intended to serve only the two goals so far identified is disputable. He's going to say that it is not. An argument can be made that there are two or three further goals as follows. So he adds to that list of the first two. Punishment ought to rectify the harm and injustice caused by crime. Punishment ought to serve as a recognized channel for the release of public indignation and anger at the offender over crime. That's a very social, out there in front of the whole society objective. And then punishment ought to make convicted offenders into better persons rather than leave them as they are or make them worse. That's an idealistic and ambitious goal, and it's something that we've had a terrible time trying to achieve in our penal system, but he's saying that it still nonetheless is a goal we ought to have. First, the first two were punishments ought to contribute to the reduction of crime, and two, they ought to be economical. And then we now have whether punishment is intended to serve only the two goals so far identified is disputable, those two. And looking at punishment ought to rectify the harm and injustice caused by crime. Well, that's restitution. That's helping to put somebody back in the condition they were in before the crime was committed. Then punishment ought to serve as a recognized channel for the release of public indignation and anger at the offender over crime. So that's retribution. And there, the criminal, the offender, is the one who receives the retribution. Lastly, punishment ought to make convicted offenders into better persons rather than leave them as they are or make them worse. And that really is the goal of rehabilitation. Those are my R's, those aren't his. But I think that's what he's saying. The problem with the last one is, and everybody, including Bedau, knows this, is that we've had a terrible time trying to accomplish rehabilitation. What happens actually in our penal system is somebody goes in as a criminal at a lower grade and comes out as a criminal at a higher grade, oftentimes by exposure to criminals who have greater skills than they did. It's just a reality. But nonetheless, he's a man of principle. He doesn't think we should give up on principle. Obviously, he says, anyone who accepts the fifth goal must reject the death penalty. If you're after rehabilitation, You have to reject the death penalty. I shall not try here to argue the merits of this goal. He's not going to. He wants you to kind of agree with him. He wants you to say, okay, I can see that that's a worthy goal. I'm not going to try to prove that to you, either in itself or relative to the other goals of punishment. He takes rehabilitation as being a worthy objective or something for us to pursue, that we would want to see people be rehabilitated. So punishment ought to rectify the harm and injustice. Well, the problem with that one, it turns out, is that it can't actually be accomplished in the case of a capital crime. When somebody takes a life, there's no way for restitution to come about. Pro-death penalty proponents find restitution not doable. I'm paraphrasing him. This is what he says. As the life cannot be retrieved or brought back. Thus, there is no possibility of restitution. And he says, so then, they focus all of their attention on the fourth point, which is that of retribution. This is his description, which is an interesting and persuasive description. So they think punishment ought to serve as a recognized channel for the release of public indignation and anger at the offender over crime. So for them, it becomes all about retribution. So remember, he has this fifth principle. He says punishment ought to make convicted offenders into better persons rather than leave them as they are or make them worse. So he asks this question, does this fourth goal, that of retribution, have a greater claim on our support than the fifth goal, that of rehabilitation? Some would argue that it is this goal and not any of the others that is the paramount purpose of the practice of punishment under law, that of retribution. Whatever else punishment does, its threat and infliction are to be seen as the expression of legitimate, he acknowledges it's legitimate, social indignation at deliberate harm to the innocent. Preserving a socially acceptable vehicle for the expression of anger at offenders is absolutely crucial to the health of a just society. So he, as an abolitionist, acknowledges this. We've got to have a way for the society to express its disapproval of the acts that were committed. It's necessary if we're going to have a just society. He proposes conceding the legitimacy and relative importance of that goal, but he points out that its pursuit, like that of all other goals, is to be constrained by moral principles. He believes that once those principles are properly employed, the death penalty ceases to be a permissible method of achieving this goal. So he paints a scenario he uses the terminology of utilitarian versus deontological. A scenario of utilitarian societal principles of punishment coming into conflict with deontological constraints that hold back the pursuit of those goals. When he's doing this, he's not saying, I stand with Kant as over against Mill and Bentham. Because the fact is that Mill and Kant are in favor of the death penalty, and Bedau is a brilliant philosopher. He knows that, and he knows that Bentham opposed it. Bedau is setting the idea, the general idea of the greatest good for the greatest number against the idea of moral duty. That's what it is. By using these terms, he's saying moral duty's got to come into the picture. He's not claiming that either one of these schools is on his side. This is just a descriptive device that he's employing. So he's saying there's a deontological aspect of this. There's a moral duty aspect of this that we need to consider. So here's his deontology. I'm calling it that. He doesn't call it that, but he has these 7 points that are basically his idea of what our duty consists of. 1, no one should deliberately and intentionally take another's life where there's a feasible alternative. He's just laying these things out there. These are sort of axiomatic. Either you accept them or you don't. He's not going to defend them. Number 2, the more severe a penalty is, the more important it is that it be imposed only on those who truly deserve it. That brings into consideration the idea of convicting and punishing the innocent. 3, the more severe a penalty is, the weightier the justification required to warrant its imposition on anyone. So we have to have extremely high standards of evidence. Number 4, whatever the criminal offense, the accused and convicted offender does not forfeit all his rights and dignity as a person. So some of you are familiar with the idea of Judge Roy Bean. He was a real man in history. In the movie, he was played by Walter Brennan, and in it he says, we're going to give you a fair trial before we hang you. This is not that kind of justice. So one of his principles is they've got to be given all the rights and privileges of a citizen as far as a fair trial under the law. Going on, then, he says there's an upper limit to the severity, cruelty, destructiveness, finality of permissible punishments regardless of the offense. We're not going to lower ourselves down to the base level of torture and that kind of thing. 6, fairness requires that punishments should be graded in their severity according to the gravity of the offense. So we wouldn't give out the death penalty for minor offenses if we were pro-death penalty. Wouldn't matter. See, these are just general principles. So there's got to be an idea of the punishment fitting the crime or suiting the crime. Lastly, if human lives are to be risked, the risk should fall more heavily on wrongdoers, the guilty, than on others, the innocent. So he acknowledges that none of these principles actually rules out the death penalty. After he's set a principled playing field, he says none of the principles does away with that. And he confesses that he knows of no one moral principle which by itself could rule out the death penalty. But there's this cumulative case that he's building here. But it is crucial to realize that these principles place a weighty burden on anyone who advocates the death penalty. That person must show that the punishment ruled upon must conform to these principles. They've got to do their due diligence, and there's a weight on them. They're the one who's arguing for the thing that's so extreme. After all, he says, outright repudiation or cynical disregard of any of these 5 principles would disqualify one from engaging in serious discourse and debate over punishment in a liberal society. And I think he has a good case there. Bedau maintains that imprisoning someone for life is less intrusive than, and it is more in conformity with the 5 principles than is capital punishment. He goes on to argue that the principle which seems to support the death penalty is the 5th one, that the punishment should fit the crime. So if murder is the worst crime, which he admits it is, then it should have the severest penalty. However, he says it does not follow from this that the punishment must be death. The severest punishment could be life without parole. Bedau says unless you accept the law of retribution, the lex talionis, practiced in what he calls a singularly literal-minded manner, unless you're kind of bloodthirsty, in other words, you are not left with no other option but the death penalty. He goes on to say that the lex talionis is not a sound principle on which to base punishment in general. Here's his argument. He says, if this principle is understood to require that punishments are unjust unless they are like the crime itself, then it doesn't work. It would require us to rape rapists, torture torturers, and inflict other horrible and degrading punishments on offenders. It would require us to betray traitors and kill multiple murderers again and again, which is impossible. Punishments impossible to inflict. Since we cannot reasonably aim to punish all crimes according to this principle, it is arbitrary to involve it as a requirement of justice in the punishment of murderers. I just hit the pause button here for a second and say, go back and see the video before this to understand that in its context, historically, the lex talionis doesn't mean you must take an eye for an eye or a life for a life. It's a limit on what you can do. All right, going forward. Bedau says that the principle of greater significance is number 7, that if human lives are to be risked, it's better to risk the lives of the guilty than those of the innocent. The point being that it's better to execute all murderers so that none of them can kill again than it is to execute none of them in order to avoid the risk of executing an innocent person. He says that when used this way, the 7th principle is just a disguised form of the first of those 2 social goals of punishment that he wrote of earlier on, which is punishments ought to contribute to the reduction of crime. So we've brought that in and we're arguing that. He states that this usage of the 7th principle in effect elevates the goal of reducing crime to a preeminence over every competing and constraining consideration, and it does away with all the other principles. We lose sight of those principles. We become myopic and we focus in on this. It has also ceased to be a constraint on policy. Second, the argument fosters the illusion that we can, in fact, reasonably estimate, if not actually calculate, the number of lives risked by a policy of abolition, the doing away with it, versus a policy of capital punishment. He says this is false. We do not and cannot reasonably hope to know what the risk is of convicting the innocent, even if we could estimate the risk of recidivist murder, people who've murdering again. We therefore cannot really compare the 2 risks with any precision. So we're left in a place where there's an indefiniteness. So he asks, what have we learned about resolving this controversy on purely rational grounds? First, the death penalty is primarily a means to one or more goals, but it's probably not the best means of reaching those goals. Second, several principles favor abolition of the death penalty. Third, there's no conclusive argument either for or against the death penalties, like, for instance, an argument which seems conclusive to one side, such as the lex talionis is for the death penalty proponents. There's no argument like that constrains both sides. One side or the other simply does not have to accept the reasons which the other side favors. Fourth, the goals and principles which he's looked at have no obvious rank or relative weighting. They're incommensurable. There's no way to measure them against one another. It's hard to say which are more important than the others. So here's his three things that he kind of winds down with. First of all, these are goals and principles that he emphasizes. He says the issue of power in the hands of the government is the first thing that he wants to address. It is preferable, all things being equal is what that phrase means, that such power over individuals shrink rather than expand. So he's a libertarian. He wants less government, not more. He's certainly not somebody who wants to have Hobbes' Leviathan for a government, this very powerful, extreme draconian government. Where such power must be used, it's better to use it for constructive rather than destructive purposes. So the government should be using its power constructively, not destructively, enhancing the autonomy and liberty of those persons directly affected by it. The death penalty is government power used in a dramatically destructive manner upon individuals in the absence of any compelling social necessity. There's nothing that says we must do this. No wonder it's the ultimate symbol of such power. And he's living when he does. He's probably thinking especially of some of the famous dictatorships of the communist countries that were exercising power over their citizens at that time. Secondly, an orientation to the future rather than the past. So we cannot do anything to benefit the dead victims of crime. We're stuck in the past if we focus on the death penalty, he's saying. But we can, or at least we can try to, do something for the living. We can protect the innocent. We can console those in despair. We don't really tend to think of that as government's job, though. And we can try to prevent future crimes. None of these constructive tasks presupposes or involve the expressive, vindictive, and retributive roles of punishment. The more we stress these rules to the neglect of all else, the more we orient our punitive policies towards the past, toward trying to use the government power over the lives of a few as a socially approved instrument of moral bookkeeping. So I have to say I don't agree with this, but this is he's making his point here. He thinks we're anchored in the past if we're focused on the death penalty. And we're just trying to settle the books as far as justice goes, make the scales balance, the scales that Lady Justice holds. Thirdly, a false image and a misleading picture of man and society is another thing that he's focusing on. Here he says, justice requires killing the convicted murderer. So we focus on the death that all murderers supposedly deserve and overlook our inability to give a rational account of why so few actually get what they deserve. Now he's pointing to the fact that very few of the people who are given a capital sentence ever actually suffer that and have it happen to them. Hence the lesson taught by the practice of capital punishment is not what its retributivist defenders infer from their theory, that we're going to take a life for a life. Far from being a symbol of justice, it's a symbol of brutality and stupidity. We fool ourselves if we think a system of ideal retributive justice designed for such persons is the appropriate model for the penal system in our society. And that's where he draws his case to a close. So what he's saying is at the end of the day, if we really try to have a morally principled approach to things, we will turn away from the death penalty and we will try to accomplish some positive things. We'll focus on the future, not the past. We'll focus on rehabilitation. And there's more that could be said there. Okay, I want to go on from there to just put before you a thought experiment. Imagine that you are in a small colony of about 115 people settling the Carolina coast in the 1580s. One of your fellow settlers savagely murders another settler in a fit of anger. Now you're in a place that has got a stockade around it. It's protected from the native peoples, the indigenous peoples that are there when you came there. The murdered man's wife and children are in shock, and the rest of the community is aghast. Another one of your fellow settlers tells you that he had heard that this same man had been charged with a murder in Yorkshire, and he was afraid to say anything about it previously when you're traveling there on the ship because he feared the murderer's reputation for violence. What do you do? How do you keep your fellow settlers safe from this man? Why do I bring this idea to you and share this with you? Because so many of my students come forward with what a brutal and cruel and inhumane practice the death penalty is, but we're living in Western liberal societies with large government supported by a lot of taxation. But if you put yourself back into a simpler place and time, when there weren't these governments of this size, and governments that did exist did not have the means that we have today and the modern conveniences that we have today, it would be very difficult to deal with somebody who's dangerous in your midst and who could represent a threat to all the rest of your fellow citizens or people who are a part of your society. So lest we judge those from the past with too strict a judgment, we need to realize they didn't have the capacity to create maximum security prisons or the many means that we have for dealing with somebody in this day and age. Okay, these are just some questions to run by you after this. So humanitarian killing, the issue is that what killing we would do, electric chair, lethal injection, the gallows in the past, firing squad, beheading by way of the what the French used, the guillotine. But that what we would do, that it would be humanitarian. That's clearly a principle always across time, that this is intended to be that it ought not to be that there's a lot of suffering that brought upon the person who's being given a death sentence. Okay, so here's just a few questions. Is the desire for a revenge where a murder is concerned ever justified? Why or why not? Well, surely there's a lot of movies made that address this, but when we're talking about justice, we're talking about balancing the scales. We're not talking about revenge. It's not society's revenge. And so it's the idea of balancing the scales. Secondly, is the death penalty appropriate for certain crimes even if it does not serve as a deterrent? So are there some crimes that are just so heinous that they are worthy of the death penalty? You heard President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, saying that yes, that some crimes are that heinous, that heinous murder is deserving of this. Okay, might the death penalty be useful but not morally just? So that's the point that Bedau was making. Is it utilitarian in the sense of the greatest good for the greatest number, but does it not meet up to certain deontological or moral duty-based requirements or prescriptions for the health of a society? Fourth, are there certain crimes where death is not sufficiently retributive, like a mass murderer, like somebody who's a serial killer? Is you taking that individual's life, and there's no way to make up for the others, but how would you have there be something that balanced the scales in that situation? What do we do with an Adolf Hitler? If he were alive, how would you compensate for him having taken millions of lives in effect? And then, is imprisonment for life a harsher penalty than capital punishment? I don't think, except as far as the loss of freedom, that most people would say this to the same degree they said it in Kant and Hegel and John Stuart Mill's day, because their prisons were nothing like our prisons. Our prisons are certainly much better, and the prisoners have much greater rights than they had back then. 6, consider this quote from your reading. Because the death penalty is irrevocable, that is, there is no way to undo an execution or compensate the executed, the execution of the innocent is an especially egregious miscarriage of justice. Therefore, we should get rid of the death penalty, since abolition is the only way to avoid such tragedies. This is one perspective on the abolition of the death penalty that says just the fact that we might administer it to somebody who's innocent, that alone should cause us to cease and desist from doing this. We're going to end there.